Hello, welcome to another episode of Global Pause Rethink the Future, where we rethink our market orientated way of life to potentialize its surpassing. So, in today's episode, I'm going to be talking more on our time and essentially how we economize it independent of our wants, but then look at this in light of, I suppose, the derivative nature of the way how we receive ourselves when we presuppose that we can actually economize our temporality. If our temporality is indivisible, then how can we economize it other than the way how we receive our time as an economic good, which I always detail out. But I want to look at it that we cannot economize our time independent of our wants. So if you're looking at it in that regards, you would think that, well, our wants are primary. So our wants are primary now because money is a given. And yet, if you cannot economize your time independent of your wants, then you would consider, in the light of that statement, that want must persist as a result of that. So we want to talk about why that would not be the case. So therefore we can understand, I suppose, in a little bit more detail, what I always advocate when I advocate that you must potentialise your time beyond the economic good to temporalise place for a common surpassing. I mean, that's essentially my spiel. I say it nearly in every single episode. And so when I'm really covering this off, it's a way of trying to understand what that means in context of the potential that exists within our lives, the marginality that we receive our lives, but then the way that we obviously work together for a common surpassing. That is, the common surpassing is temporalised in a place, so literally is localised where you are, where that common surpassing is with other people that are sharing in that way. So to economise, time independent from the want. Now, a want here, we would think of want, the satisfaction maybe of a want, I could say, because then that would give the end of, say, an exchange. So if me going down to the street to buy an ice cream is to satisfy the want of the ice cream, so the intense experience of the flavour of the taste, that's what I mean when I say want. So I probably should have qualified it slightly differently, because that's the qualitative intensive state of our temporality, is the experience of that. So that might only be an isolated instance of that intensiveness. But the issue here is that when we presuppose that we can economise our time independent from the experience, well, then it means to say that the world in which you share, as I always talk about, becomes derivative to a degree, or beholden to that unavowed utopianism, when the intrapersonal exchanges is really what underwrites our wants. So when you're looking at wants, we have to give due consideration to not only the experience or the end, so the satisfaction of, so that intensive qualitative experience of it, but then also look at the way how, because if you look at that in context outside our way of life, which is essentially to engender want as a relationality, and that's because money is a given, which I always say, then we have to look at the way how that you cannot economise your time independent from it. It means to say that you're really looking at want, but then the substitution for, what does want substitute for? All right, when we presuppose that we can economise our time independent from it, because if we presuppose that we can in fact economise our time, then it's the economisation of the time that's independent from our experience of our temporality. And I always talk about that is just has recourse, or that just highlights the unavowed atemporal nature of our spiritual aspiration when we presuppose that we can claim independence from you could either say independence from existence, independent from the world, independence from the earth, independence from life. There's something about it that the way how you frame it is that you might we might be on the earth, but then the aspiration highlights that it's kind of, like I said, it's always the afterlife or the divine Sabbath. So something that is kind of evocative of a transcendence that is literally removed from earth, that is not implicated or imminent within life on the planet. So when you're looking at that, the substitution, you could say, is the substitution, because I always talk about that consumption as a substitutable activity for richer experiences with other people, but the experiences with other people is a way how that you're experiencing yourself as indivisible. So I always talk that we are marginal in reference to the end that we presuppose, but we are indivisible as people to be born. But because we're beholden to a culture that say temporalizes our existence into a means end continuum, then we're beholden to an order of time that sequentially orders us in order to discipline us in reference to that end. So our way of life is about us getting credit towards life. So when you, but the thing about it here is that when that is the given and you presuppose money, then the want is the thing that kind of conceals that spiritual aspiration from ourselves, whereby that if you're resolving upon your want of life, then it can be substituted or can cycle upon itself. But the here is that, so if you have a want of life, you're having the want of life to be indivisible. But if you've turned yourself into a means into the end, then you can never temporalize the indivisibility of your temporality, because our way of life presupposes that you must become a means towards the end of being indivisible. All right. And so in that case, your wants are a way of creating a circuit or a holding pattern where you're consuming the want of a self that would be indivisible, but because you're beholden to a culture that you can't see around it, and it legitimizes want as a relationality and as an activity, as the way how you share, then you share yourself marginally through your wants for the substitution essentially of a self that would be indivisible. All right, so why is it important from that aspect to consider that you cannot economise time independent from your wants, as it were? So you would have to look at then what you're substituting for in order for that economisation not to be contingent. All right, so in that regards, if we're looking at the way how you're potentialising the indivisibility of your temporality, then and that's the way how you share yourself, then sharing of the self makes the want contingent on the world that you share with other people. All right, and so if you're sharing through the world through the legitimacy of your wants, then to share yourself in a qualitatively different manner means to say that the substitutable activity of your wants lessens as a result of that. So it displaces it. All right. And so therefore you cannot be seen to be economising your time independent from them, because you are temporalising the indivisibility of your temporality, such that the substitutable activity of your wants is obviously lessened as a result. So in that case, we have to see that the want, because if want is engendered, it's about the way how, if you think of what aspirational branding is about, creating, say, a gap or aspiration that you're meant to fill through buying whatever kind of product it may be. Now, we can relate it to a specific product, so the way how that a specific brand would define its value proposition or its aspirational kind of brand story that it obviously perpetuates. But if you only look at it within the context of one specific business and not give due consideration to the spiritual aspiration and the want of life that we all share, then you're never going to look at the branding of our way of life and what you're beholden to when you only consider it in that regards, because you're not giving due consideration to what underwrites any legitimacy of marketing or branding, which is obviously our way of life. So when you're looking at when you're looking at the way how you can orientate yourself towards the indivisibility of your temporality, that's why it brings to the fore the nature of marketing and branding, because marketing as a branding is about disinhibiting your wants, so not only engendering wants but disinhibiting them. And so through the disinhibition of your wants, that is you acting out or giving, that's your sense of agency, right? So our sense of agency is what we buy in that regards. And so therefore what you're doing is that you, through that disinhibition of your wants, you are realizing maybe the vision that you have for yourself in the way how that you share yourself when you're beholden to a world that legitimizes your wants as an end, which is ultimately to conceal or substitute for you being indivisible. Because the way how you would show up in the world if you were indivisible, then you'd be orientated towards life in a qualitatively different way compared to one that presupposes you have to become a means towards the end. Because ultimately you're securing the means in order to, you're becoming a means in order to secure the end. And the end here is the aspiration that we're holding out for ourselves when you're beholden to a way of life that presupposes that. All right, so it's always a hermeneutical kind of, or a vicious circle, for want of a better way of describing it, just feeds upon itself. But if we're looking at our way of life it's not commodities, it's not products other than this consumer you are, because to be obviously a consumer is a diminution of agency or lack of creativity, and that's where the world becomes a given. And so therefore, if the world becomes a given, the world is given for your wants, and then time recedes, then you don't reflect upon the implication of your temporality when you accept your time as an economic good, and what you're beholden to when you presuppose that, when the legitimacy of your want predominates in the relationality to obscure that. Okay, so, to economise your time independent from your wants is you cannot do it. If we are indivisible, then you cannot. If you're indivisible, then you can never economise your time, I suppose, is the one thing that we could look at it. Because if you're indivisible, where's the rationale for the economisation that you presuppose? Because then that would presuppose that your actions are not inherently creative. There's just something about the world that you've accepted as a given, and so therefore you have to economise in reference to it. But if that's not given, then that means to say that you don't need to economise in reference to it, because the indivisibility of your temporality is fully creative. And so what you're doing is that you're giving the spirit the ability to incarnate it's the heart's intent, as it were, but in a way where if you're giving credit for what you do, it can only be given credit as far as not only your well-being, but to a certain degree the well-being of others. And so when I give context to one's heart's desire, well, we would never give credit to a person that what they're orientated towards is antithetical to anything that we presuppose for ourselves. So the mirroring here is kind of important, because I say, if I am a ceramicist and I like to make bowls, and you've got another person that likes to make weapons that are designed to kill human beings, you can't give credit to a person for that, because that's something that I would not accept for myself. So how could you give credit to another person as far as them temporalizing the indivisibility of their temporality as far as that end goes? All right, it's completely repulsive. Okay, so when you're looking at it from that, the mirroring that we presuppose in our way of life. So if we talk about the acquisitive mimesis, which is a Girardian kind of understanding of what gives rise to and we only have to look at the children, the way how they mimic us to understand that's the way how obviously children learn, and obviously adults do, and even within neurology there's mirror neurons as well. The issue here is that the mimesis is not in and of itself a problem, because it just depends on the nature of what you're mimicking or what you're taking cues from. So if you're taking cues from another so a cue here is that you're looking, okay, we're marginal. All right, so we're all marginal. All right, we all understand that we're marginal in reference towards life, and yet that's if we all have the understanding of temporalizing the indivisibility of our temporality, but the only way that we can do that is to potentialize your time beyond the economic good, then that's the cue. The act, it becomes an act that begets another act. All right, so therefore, what are you doing when a person acts in that way, and then you take your cue from that act, and then another person does it, and then you have this kind of bouncing, this indirect nature as the way how you're doing it. What you're doing is that the same mechanism that engenders consumption and consumerism as a pathological activity is the same thing that gives rise to something that engenders a relationality that's based upon creativity. All right, so it's the same mechanism that's put in play, but the relationality is the determining factor. But the determining factor here is if you have a want of life because you presuppose independence from the claim that otherwise works on you, and so the spiritual aspiration that you legitimize in your activity when you are mimicking somebody else is to lay claims to the sign of that transcendence. But then you step back from that and give the same mechanism in context to something that you're considering, okay, we're marginal, we are temporalizing our time beyond the economic good to temporalize place for a common surpassing. So the spiritual aspiration might be independence, but it's not being individualized, it becomes potentialized as a people. Now that obviously as a people, to be a people means to say there's a relationality that people share. Now the relationality is the defining factor of the way how the mimesis would engender a dynamic, a cultural phenomenon that's not predicated upon a diminution of what it means to be, but rather works contra to that as potentializing what it means to be. So looking at the way how that the culture that we're beholden to inhibits our flourishing, and so presupposes that we become a means towards the end, rather than considering us to be indivisible and then supporting the emergence of a culture that allows that flourishing to unfold through time. They're qualitatively different ways you're approaching life, and one does not presuppose a economization of something that is independent from existence or the world at large, that, like I said, has the vestiges of a transcendentalism that we, for want of a better, people just are not aware of to the degree that you need to be in order to understand how your own spiritual aspirations towards life can be a hook that not only engenders or keeps us in a holding pattern that potentializes the dystopian future, which I've talked about prior, through your own aspirations. Anyway, so I just thought it would be another way of kind of dealing with the issue of the substitutable activity of consumption, but in light of the self, as it were, in inverted commas, because here the self is just given qualitatively differently. You're not anchoring yourself in time because you're a means towards the end. It's about the dynamism that allows you to explore your temporality, where you're not necessarily kind of putting a flag in the sand, for want of a better way of describing it, saying this is me. You're allowed dynamism, movement. Your identity basically is not beholden to anything in that regards. And so it's a way of freeing us towards life, whereby because the thing is that if you're engendering a culture and that's, we're talking about the indivisibility of your temporality and the indivisibility of a people and the indivisibility of creativity and the indivisibility of the earth, literally. So, there is no inside, outside, above, below. There is no sacred, profane. It's all indistinguishable. It is absolutely life. But the one thing that clarifies that is the culture. All right, is the culture that allows that. All right, now if that culture can claim, in inverted commas, when I say claim, can claim literally every cultural formation on the face of the planet now, when you bring it back to what you're beholden to. All right. If the model for life is to be a consumer, and that way of life has gone right around the globe, where the predominance of a market-orientated way of life is a model for life, and what underwrites that, the preeminent good of your time, then you have to look at that as the absolute denominator. And it doesn't matter. All culture is supplementary or subordinate, becomes a supplement and invariably becomes subordinate to that. All right, so it means to say that any cultural formation can be potentialized in a way that not only, like I always talk, that not only does justice to that tradition, but is not beholden to it, because you're literally looking at what's at play now for people, just people. All we are is just people, no ones. Like I always say, it's the no ones of the world will create the world. It's not top-down managerialism, technocratic kind of utopian kind of dispensation or arrogation, basically. You're talking about people that actually are the ones that create, the ones that actually do stuff. It's not talking about elites that do fucking nothing. Like, if you're looking at it from the aspect of hedge funds, that all they do is move money around. They actually don't do anything. There's nothing as far as a common well, as it were, that they do. They don't do anything. They don't actually. There's nothing of value basically there. And the thing is that there's nothing of value. You only know that the value is only predicated upon your time as an economic good, because that obviously the convention of money reigns. You animate goodwill. Where is the managerialism? That it presupposes the rarefied means of money in order to have dispensation or the way how decision-making process gets captured through the convention of that, all right? Because this is the thing. If you think about it, if you're potentializing a different way of giving and receiving that's more dynamic, that means to say that there's nothing that can utilize that you don't presuppose for your life when you act in a way that temporalizes that, where you're looking at the relationality about trust, about goodwill, that's not pushed to a locus or somewhere outside the relationality that you share. When you do that, absolutely completely different. It doesn't presuppose managerialism in any way, shape or form. Anyway, until next time, take care.